Welcome to CareerBuzz, Canada's unique radio conversation that empowers lives, enriches careers, and energizes organizations. I'm your host, Shelley Deloyer, career expert, coach, and professional trainer at Bright Futures. I'm pleased to be your host today on CareerBuzz. Thanks for tuning in. Today on our show, I'm talking with Fazeena Haniff, the conscious communicator. Fazeena is a communications expert with 20 years of experience. She's a board-certified coach, speaker, consultant, and facilitator of challenging conversations around diversity, equity and inclusion, and unconscious bias. Fazeena empowers individuals to reclaim their voice from past and intergenerational trauma and disempowering societal, cultural, and family dynamics so they can become powerful communicators. She holds a unique position for combining her many years of professional experience in communication with her ability to recognize patterns that influence a person's or organization's ability to communicate so they can facilitate powerful breakthroughs. Together, we're going to open up a great conversation about the perspectives on social justice with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am thrilled to have you joining me today, Fazeena. Welcome to CareerBuzz.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be really great. And I'm super excited for our listeners to be able to hear and experience everything that you have to offer. So let's dive in by filling your listeners in on who you are and what your work involves. Can you give us a bit of an overview there?
Yes, of course. So I'm, as you said, the conscious communicator is my business. I'm a communications coach. And I bring the 20 years of that experience in corporate communications and public relations with my coaching. And what I do is I work mainly with individuals in professional spaces, entrepreneurs, or in the workplace, to become powerful communicators by looking at not just the words that they use and how they use them, but the different influences that we don't necessarily look at that impact the way that we communicate. So, of course, there's body language and facial expressions and voice intonation, but also things like how our emotions play a part in communication, how the voice in our head impacts our ability to communicate, whether we say something or we hold back. And I look at other things like, as you mentioned, societal, cultural, and family influences, things that we experienced at a younger age and how that impacts our ability to communicate many years later. And of course, I provide consulting experience with organizations when we're looking at organizational communication, culture, change, and of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow. Okay. There is so much that we can dive into just in everything that you said right there. So what I'm hearing is that, you're looking at the things that are the elements of communication. So how do you communicate and verbally and non-verbally, but it goes so much deeper than that. And hearing you talk about, how do your emotions play into this and the voice in your head. So I think that is a great place to dive into a little bit more right off the top to take a look at, for people who may be new or newer to the idea of the voice in my head plays an impact in my communication. Let's break that down a little bit and explain the importance of paying attention to your own self-talk.
Yes. So we all have that voice in our head. It's just whether we're aware of it or we're not, or how aware of it we are. So, just thinking of an experience where you might be going into a meeting, for example, or you have to present, whether it's to a team or just a few people or a client. And before you head into that meeting, what's the kind of thing that's going on in your mind? Like, what are the thoughts? What are the, are you being told you've got this? Or are you being told something like, I don't know, are you ready for this? Can you actually do this? So it's really spending some time to listen beforehand about what kinds of words are being said in your head by your self-talk. Mm-hmm. Is it encouraging, or is it placing some self-doubt that might play into how you end up having that conversation or present that information to people?
Yeah, absolutely. And then how about with the emotional piece, right? So that voice in your head is so important. And I think for a lot of people, it's recognizing that you can change that voice in your head. You don't have to be the victim of your own inner voice. You can have power over it instead of it having power over you. And then same thing with your emotions. So let's talk about that a little bit more as well.
Absolutely. We definitely have a lot more power over it than we realize. And it starts with awareness. Like awareness is the biggest piece of creating change, because once we have it in our awareness, then we can recognize that there's something going on, and that whether we like it the way it is or we want to change it and switch it up. So that's the first piece. Now, when it comes to emotions, the really interesting thing is, so many of us have not been brought up with the experience of really knowing what our emotions are, really feeling what they are, understanding them. And I think it's really in the last number of years that we've just started to really talk about emotional health and putting words around emotions. And, when I work with clients, what's really interesting is that when we first start talking about emotions, people say happy, sad, and mad. And then to actually name other emotions like perplexed or frustrated or hopeless or whatever it might be, it's harder to put words around those things. So what's happening when we're going into communication situations? Now, I always use the example of when we're in a conflict, for example. And if we're feeling anger, but we're not necessarily tuned in to that emotion, but we're going into the experience and we're fighting, right? We're not actually taking hold and control of what that emotion is before we go into that experience. So the emotion ends up overpowering us and ends up controlling the words that we use and how we present ourselves in terms of our body language and our voice intonation, and will have a big impact on how that exchange happens. Whereas if we had more understanding of our emotions and we knew going into an experience that we were feeling angry, then we could actually take a step back and think, okay, how do I want this exchange to take place? What is the outcome that I want to have happen? And is this the state, the emotional state I want to go into it in?
Right.
So when we have that awareness and we can name what's happening for us and take that step back, then we can approach our exchanges from a different place.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's such an empowering place where people can realize I get to own this process. I am in control. I have the power to change what's going on in my mind, in my body, and therefore can change the outcomes and the results that I'm getting as well. That is like such an empowering approach, as opposed to just saying like, well, this is just how I talk, or this is just who I am, or this is just, what's happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you also mentioned, taking a look at things like family influences and different life experiences you've had and how that plays into your communication as well. Can you open that up a bit further for us?
Yes, of course. So we are in this very impressionable stage from like the ages of 0 to 7. So what we are experiencing in our environments at that time have a real impact on the beliefs that we create around who we are and how we operate in the world. And so I use this example, it's my own personal example, is I grew up in a family, in a culture where I wasn't necessarily encouraged to speak up as a girl. And it was more about, being quiet and just letting other people have the spotlight and not necessarily sharing too much. And I didn't realize how much that had stayed with me through, high school and university and going into the workplace, and of course now running a business. And so it was more about digging deeper and looking at, my experiences growing up with respect to how I was encouraged to speaking up or not speaking up, and how that impacted how I showed up, for example, in the boardroom. when I was working in my previous job, or when I'm with a group of entrepreneurs and I have some ideas that I want to share, and I might notice that, wait a minute, I'm not actually sharing them as I thought I would. And what's that about? And the more I thought about it, and the more I looked at it, and the more I'd experienced it with other clients, I could find like this pathway backwards where people weren't encouraged to communicate or speak up, or if they had a bad experience where they were made fun of, for example, at school, when they presented something and then they clammed up, and they still have that residue of those experiences show up much later on in adult life.
Right. Yeah, I think, we often underestimate the power of those experiences and those influences and what we go through as a young kid, and how it continues to play out 10, 20, 40, 60 years later. And being able to really own those experiences and take some responsibility for working through them so that we can do things differently.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. And you know what, the other thing about that is, it could be like something that happened like in a family, or in your family, or in your personal experiences. But then, it's translating in your adult life, in your professional experiences. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a personal to personal experience. It's just that that feeling of having being in that same place where you need to speak up or manage a conflict, and you had an adverse experience at a younger age that shows up in the adult age.
Yeah, that's like you said, with having, experiences around shutting down as a girl, thinking that, my voice is less important or something along those lines, and then carrying that into your working life, even, how many decades later. Yeah. Okay. Now, you also mentioned that you do work, within organizations, which I think is so important to mention here too, because if people are showing up in their working world, and we know that who you're showing up as professionally is going to be influenced by what's going on in all other areas of your life as well. We like to think, I think, we tend to approach our work as compartmentalizing ourselves. Like, this is my work self, and then this is my personal self over here. And I will be these separate people. And, I'll step into this completely different frame and box and persona in my working world. And then my personal life is different. And there's times where that's helpful. I show up differently with my kids than I do as an entrepreneur, than I do with clients and things like that. And there are different perspectives around these personas that is helpful, but ultimately you're one person. And how your personal life plays into your professional life, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you do within organizations, and just how you blend that personal work with professional work.
Yes. So one of the big areas would be around difficult conversations.
Yeah.
And so we need to have difficult conversations at home, and we need to have difficult conversations in the workplace. And chances are that our fears and our doubts are very similar when it comes to personal and professional. So even though we can compartmentalize things, when we're sort of being pushed on the edge towards having to be in an uncomfortable position. So whether it's having a really, a conversation about finances with a spouse versus giving feedback to your team that you may not necessarily want to give, or making organizational changes where someone might be losing a job, right? We're being placed and pushed into uncomfortable situations. Mm-hmm. So it's really about, helping the individual to have the skills and the resources they need to have those conversations, whether it is personal or in the workplace. In organizations, like, there's so many different things that are going on when we're communicating with people about things like, restructuring, or diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Mhm.
right? We're touching on things that people feel at a very personal level, right? Whether it is about safety, their safety, job security, safety, or organizational culture safety. There are different pieces that need to be managed. So when we're communicating in an organization, it's really important to keep those pieces in mind, so that when the message goes out, we're also recognizing the array of reactions that we might get as a result of that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, why do you choose to do this work? What has led you into, dedicating your work and your business into conscious communication as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yes. So for me, communication, I've always loved communication, and it's just something that connecting with people, regardless of background and age and whatnot, has always come very natural to me. And so at a very early age, I knew I wanted to be in communication. I think I was like 14. And I don't think I even knew what public relations really was, but I was like, I'm going to be in public relations. And I literally I got my degree in communications, and started out very early on, and so, which is why there's 20 years of experience. It's
Yeah.
funny how time flies.
Mhm.
So I've always loved writing and speaking, and putting things into words and sharing ideas and all of that. But then, I obviously left that career behind a number of years ago, and started my own business. And what that was about was recognizing that, and this is where the conscious piece comes in, is recognizing that a lot of what I was doing was sort of what I call the dressing of communication, right? It's the output, it's the words, it's the gloss, it's the look and the shine.
Right.
And then there was this other piece of all those other influences that we talked about, like emotions and the self-talk in your head and the patterns you learn from a young age that also influence how we communicate. So conscious communication came about by marrying the two,
Beautiful.
and bringing it together in sort of what you would call a holistic approach
Right.
to communication.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of my next questions was going to be, what does conscious communication mean to you? And I think you just answered that. Like it's going so much further beyond the outward communication and what other people see, and really marrying that and blending that with the inner world as well.
Yes, and it's very foundational. So, it's very easy to go to like workshops that teach you how to put together a speech, how to stand up there and deliver it, or how to put sentences together and how to make this look good. But if the foundation has some faults in it, or some things that need to be repaired, such as these beliefs that, maybe my voice doesn't matter, or what I have to say doesn't make sense, or I'm not smart enough, or anything like that that's showing up, then it doesn't matter how many of those sort of like how-tos that we do and learn about. We're still going to end up, we're sort of on a hamster wheel of ending up with the same result and frustration.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. It's so important and so much needed work. And I'm super excited for you to be bringing this to individual people and organizations. It's very powerful. So, how did you get to this place? What has your journey looked like that has brought you into this place of being in communications and an entrepreneur and coach? How did you get here?
Yeah. So, of course, we talked about the love for communication and how that became the career pursuit that was a great and incredible experience. So, without that, I wouldn't be here because that was so much of my journey. But I think what really has brought me into this place of being an entrepreneur is that call to want to have an impact, and to be that change in the world, in my part of the world. and to add something that's uniquely mine, that brings together, my experience, my training, and my own unique abilities and skills, to bring forth this holistic approach to communication. I call it a bit of a disruption to the normal way of how we're taught communication, and it's something that I want to continue spreading and sharing this different perspective.
Yeah, brilliant. I love it. So, in your own journey, your professional and your personal growth journey, what have been sort of the biggest challenges that you've faced along the way?
Yes. Well, any journey has its challenges, right? But I think the biggest one has been the shift from 9 to 5 to being an entrepreneur. And I don't think people tell you, like, it looks like entrepreneurship looks like sexy online, right? Like we've got all of these, people having, meetings at coffee shops and outdoors and all this other stuff. But,
The laptop lifestyle.
the laptop lifestyle that can happen anywhere in the world, right? When you've got an internet connection. And I think where we don't spend enough time looking at the journey of an entrepreneur is the fact that it's one of the biggest risks a person can take, and one of the biggest roles you can step into. And as a result of that, it will bring up every kind of insecurity that you have. Whether it's about your own confidence and your own ability, or money is a huge one, and your ideas around abundance and financial security, and feeling like you can actually do this. And so, having to work through those different pieces, I would say, has been incredibly challenging, but also really rewarding, because it's really helped me to see and recognize, ways I haven't been kind to myself, in ways that I haven't believed in myself, and to shake that up. And you build resilience like crazy as an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
And flexibility, like to be able to go with the flow, and to take whatever's coming at you and to keep going. It's really quite wild.
Absolutely. And so, through those challenges, what have the biggest learnings that have come out of those challenges, and you're moving through them?
Yeah. So the biggest learnings for me have been about the need for self-discipline.
Absolutely.
Yes, especially when you're in sort of a 9 to 5 world, it's your schedule's basically laid out for you. When you're an entrepreneur, it's like you've got to create this all on your own. It's like taking a blank page and putting things wherever you want to put them. But finding out what works for me personally, not necessarily, following what, this person's saying or that person's saying, because everybody's different. So the biggest learning has been really getting to know myself and implementing, self-discipline and processes, and whatever works best for me, and to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I find there's, two types of people. Some people, when they get into entrepreneurship, they need the self-discipline so that they do set aside their time to work and really stick to what they need to do. So they're not, oh, I could do some laundry, or I could bake some cookies, or I could go do whatever else. And then other people need it in the opposite, so that they can turn it off. And your office is in your home. Potentially you could work day and night. You can do anything at any time. So it's like, oh, just, I'll just take 20 minutes to finish this off, and then working into 2 a.m, because that sort of self-discipline isn't there to know when to turn it off. So I feel it goes both ways.
Yes. And the pendulum can go, swing either way. It's at different times.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to know, from your perspective and your experience, can you tell us about some of the issues that you see and are aware of when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in society, but also in the workplace today?
Yes. So, obviously, social justice has risen to the forefront, and into a lot of conversations and action in the last several months. And some of the issues that I've seen, it's really interesting because diversity, equity, inclusion isn't new, right? It's been around for a long time, and the need for it has been it's been needed so much, in like always. And but the events of the last several months have really pushed it to the forefront. So it's interesting to see, like being on LinkedIn, for example, how many organizations are hiring for diversity, equity, and inclusion employees. And the question I always have is like, why only now, right? And I think that really dives into some of the issues that we're seeing. There are, I've heard of some organizations who are really taking their work to a very deep level, and there's a lot of training that's happening at the leadership level, but figuring out the best ways to support employees as well. And there's really like a holistic approach. And then there are experiences where organizations are just hiring diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. But where is the work happening with respect to the leadership team?
Yeah.
And so the question comes around performance versus sustainable change. And it's sustainable change that we need. Yeah. And so that, I think, is the biggest issue, is looking at how do we do that? And it means like the full gamut of looking at unconscious bias, for example, looking at our policies, looking at how we can better support Black, Indigenous, people of color employees, and not just Black, Indigenous, people of color employees, all marginalized groups of people in society.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so it feels like, some people are really digging in and doing that work. And then other people have more of sort of like a checkbox approach. Like, look, we hired this person, we did this thing, or we read this book, or we watched this documentary, or whatever it is. So what do you think is really needed in order to create that level of sustainable change?
Yes. So what we really need is for people to commit and not look at it as a checkbox, right? The checkbox isn't going to go anywhere, because I'm telling you already that your employees who are affected already see through that. Nice. So it's really just a waste of time and money if you're just checking a box and not actually committed to the change. So commitment to the change means looking at the leadership team and having the courage and commitment to recognize how deeply racism and racist sentiment is embedded in all of us. And that's where we're talking about like the unconscious piece of this, right? Is that we operate in a society that systemic racism is real, systemic oppression is real, and it happens so instantly, like sort of like your morning routine, where you just literally are, you're programmed to you're not thinking about what you're doing in the morning. Our racist sentiments are embedded in us in such a way that we don't even realize what we're doing. But now we're being told that we're doing harm. So for us to have change, we actually have to come to the table and say, okay, I'm going to look at myself and see how I'm doing harm.
Yeah. And that, speaking just from my personal experience, is so hard to do, because there's so many people that will say, oh, but I'm not racist. Right. And things like, I don't see color, and all lives matter. And I think I've had a number of these conversations, even just with people close to me, family members, and saying like, I understand, and I feel like I never mean harm, but that doesn't mean that what I'm seeing and what I'm saying and my actions aren't causing harm. That's two different things. And if we don't have the courage to say, I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what I'm not seeing. And there, of course, is going to be something there, because we've all been raised this way. We've all gone through different experiences that have led to unconscious bias, that have led to different filters and different thoughts and beliefs. And if we're not willing to look at them, then we're going to continue to not even know what we don't know.
Absolutely. And the harm continues to happen,
Yeah.
right? And so you touched on intent versus impact, right? Like none of us, we're not intending it. I mean, some people do intend it, right? But for the most part, people are not intending to do it, but there is an impact.
Yeah.
And I sort of I relate it to being in relationship with someone, and nobody wants to be told that you hurt that person. Right? Nobody wants to be told that you did something that caused harm. Nobody wants to hear that. But it doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? And if you care about your relationship, then you're going to do something about it.
Yeah.
And if you care about society, and you care about your workplace, and you care about your employees, and you care about your friends, then you're going to do something about it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's hard work, yes, because you're looking at things that you haven't had to necessarily look at before, which is the whole privilege piece of that, right? Yeah. And so, but if you're really committed to like, I want this world to be a better place, there's no way around it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think the privilege piece is such an interesting conversation from the perspectives that I've had anyways, because I've heard people saying, but I've suffered too, right? As a white person, but I've had trouble in my life. I've had illness, I've had loss, I've had grief, I've had whatever struggle. I've, lived a life of poverty, whatever it might be. And I think it's so important to point out that nobody's trying to say that that isn't real. Nobody's trying to say that you haven't struggled and that your life has been amazing. But it's a different conversation. So I'd love to hear your perspective on what does it actually mean to acknowledge white privilege, and your response to somebody who's saying, a white person saying, but I've struggled too.
Yeah. Well, for me, that's like, of course you struggled, right? We're all human. We all have different experiences. We all have traumas from our past or in our present that we have to work through. And I get that. And I respect that. And I appreciate it. However, race is not part of that for you, but it is for me. And it is for the Black, Indigenous people of color around you who are continuing to suffer in various degrees. And so, yes, I recognize that you have had pain or you're in pain and what your experience is, but I'm asking you to see me. And that race and racial trauma is part of my own experience.
Yeah. And until we see it that way, it feels like it's a me versus you or us versus them conversation. Like, yeah, you've struggled, but I've struggled too. So, whose pain gets to be worse? Whose pain gets to be bigger? And we got to stop that conversation.
Yeah. And it goes back to relaying it to a relationship again, right? And if I say to my spouse, like, well, my suffering's more than your suffering. And then my spouse says, well, my suffering's more than your suffering. Like, when are we going to get past that?
Right.
Our relationship is doomed.
Yeah.
So if we want to live in this place called a society together, then we have to start recognizing and seeing each other for who we are and creating space for us to exist.
Yeah. Yeah. Existing together, raising each other up, instead of feeling like the only way I can raise up is by stepping on somebody else.
Yeah, it's like this race to the bottom.
Mm.
And I never understood the race to the bottom, right? Because why can't we all elevate,
Yeah.
right? Like, why can't we all rise up?
Yeah.
Why does it, yeah, why does it have to be a win-lose?
Exactly.
Why
Yeah.
is it a
Exactly.
competition?
Yeah. Yeah. In the win-lose situation, it's, there's only room for one of us at the top, or there's only room for one person to succeed in any relationship. So I got to step on you in order for me to climb up. And like you said, it ends up being a race to the bottom because you're just going to each continue to pull each other down.
Yes.
Or something else will pull you down along the way. Yeah. Whereas an abundance mindset is saying there is room for everyone to rise. There's room for all of us to grow. There is enough pie to go around. Everybody can have a piece. We're not running out of pie.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you mentioned abundance, because scarcity is really what it's about.
Yeah.
Right. Like when we're competing, it's because, it's like, well, if a white person feels that I have to give up my space for a Black person to exist. But why is that thought even there?
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's the scarcity mindset of recognizing, like, I could take a step back and I'm still who I am, to create space for Black, Indigenous people of color. I still have opportunities available for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's not taking away from me. I'm creating space for other people.
Yeah.
Who deserve that space.
Yes. Yeah. And when you come from that abundance mindset, knowing that you can create that space for other people, that they are so deserving of that, and that yourself, while you're doing that, are honoring your own humanity, and more opportunities will continue to come because it's not pie. You're not going to run out. It's an abundance mindset where there's always more. There's more opportunities, there's more possibilities, there's more love to go around, there's more of everything good. But when we live in that scarcity mindset, it's got to be me or you, so I want it to be me.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, this is such an important conversation that I want to continue having for, like it's not a one-time conversation. It can't be a one-time conversation. So I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm so glad that you're doing this work so that people can continue to have the conversation, because it needs to be ongoing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk about unconscious bias. I know we talked about it a little bit, and I just want to really unpack what unconscious bias is for people who might be learning about this for the first time.
Yeah. So unconscious bias. So first of all, it is outside of your awareness. So this is where, for example, and I'll use the workplace as the setting, where only certain employees get promotions or raises, or opportunities for the fancier projects. Maybe certain employees get a different tone from a manager,
right,
versus other employees get a harsher tone. And I'm specifically not using specific races here, just so listeners can start to recognize how these things play out.
Yeah.
So we interact with people based on our unconscious bias, right? And if we haven't understood and learned that, we have been taught that other, right? So often Black, Indigenous people of color are unknown or unsafe or not misunderstood, then we tend to approach them unconsciously from a place of, well, I don't know if they can do this work, or I don't know if they've got it cut out for this job. And so we'll end up interacting with them in ways outside of our awareness where we don't necessarily give them the opportunities that we would white employees.
Right.
So that's just one example of it. Or, you know, we might be harsher on them and give them more work, like more laborious work, right? Whereas we might give white employees more of the leadership pieces,
right?
Because that's where leadership unconsciously goes, right? And so unconscious bias, that's just the workplace, right? There's unconscious bias shows up, you know, walking down the street and you see a person of color, a white person sees a person of color, and maybe they cross the road because, you know, unconsciously didn't realize that they're playing out a fear that they have unconsciously, that they've been taught, right? Not necessarily that they've had that experience, but it's unconscious.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of the messages that we've been taught.
Yeah.
So unconscious bias is really taking the time to look at how our language and our behaviors, our attitudes show bias for one group of people, white people over other people, for example, in this context. So it's really important to do this type of work in the workplace, especially because people are impacted hugely.
Right.
And we need to give space for those conversations to happen and that deeper work to happen. This is the deep inner work that a lot of people are avoiding.
Yeah. It's uncomfortable, right? So I love how you opened up our conversation by talking about having difficult conversations and facilitating difficult conversations, because it's pre-framing for people that, this is uncomfortable. And that's not a reason to not do it.
Right.
Right? You can't use the discomfort as your rock to hide under, to say, oh, I'm not going to dig into this stuff because it's so uncomfortable. If you do that, you're contributing to the problem.
Right.
And that alone is really hard for people to hear.
Yeah. And there's no growth without discomfort. Right? Nobody's saying this is going to be easy.
Yeah.
Right. But again, if we want to create inclusive spaces where people feel like they belong and they genuinely have a space and are treated with respect for who they are and welcomed and taken care of, then we need to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Nobody's saying this is going to be easy, but it is necessary, and it's required, and it's important for our society to grow and evolve together, or we can, stay repeating the same cycles we've been repeating over and over from the past and staying in the same problems and refuse to grow. And I'm not in for that.
Yeah, me neither.
That sounds horrible. That sounds way more uncomfortable. Yeah. So if we know, so unconscious bias is what you don't know that you need to know. And if you don't know it, then let's talk about how we do something about it when we don't even know what we don't know.
Yes. So a lot of it, again, is bringing it into awareness, education, right? Yeah. There's so many resources. There are so many, there are consultants and experts out there who are doing this work. So, just like we would pick up the phone to find out about a service that we need for our house or whatever it is, like there's so much out there, like Google, right? And we can call someone and pay them for their services to teach us about it.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's how we're going to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. I love you're using the house analogy, and it's like, if you've got a plumbing issue and your pipes are broken, you're going to pay that plumber to come and fix the problem for you.
Yes.
And the same thing is true here. If you've got a culture within an organization that isn't supporting Black, Indigenous people of color, or isn't actively showing and doing the work to grow diversity, equity, and inclusion within your organization or personally, right? Like if you're going, oh, I don't know what I don't know, and I want to dig into that, then that's a problem that you can reach out to and get support from people who are experts in this area, like yourself. So as a coach, if you're guiding somebody through uncovering their unconscious bias and doing this inner work, what does your approach to that look like?
Yeah. So a lot of it is creating the space for people to show up and be imperfect in this. Because when you're learning about things that you don't know you even need to know, or you don't know you needed to know, it's it's creating that space where they can feel like they can show up and mess up and learn and then get up again. And so for me, the biggest piece is creating that space that feels like it's one where I could show up and I can learn because I genuinely want to learn.
Yeah.
So first of all, the person has to genuinely want to learn
Mm-hmm.
before I work with them, because this isn't, I'm not a check mark type of person. Like, you're not just going to hire me to check a box, because I will call it out. And so it's having those committed people come in and creating that space for them to show up and to be raw and to learn things about themselves that they may not have liked learning, but who are willing to show up and do the work. And so for me, having the coaching training that I do, looking at unconscious mind patterns, for example, it's guiding people through a process of recognizing the different concepts and stories that are anchoring this mindset of supremacy, and helping them to see how those concepts are showing up in behavior and attitude,
Right.
and the work that they're doing, in their organizations.
Yeah. I love how you set the stage for saying that, you create space for people to mess up and to do it wrong and to learn, because I know for anybody like me, it's really hard to come into a situation like this going, I know I'm going to do it wrong. And I know I'm going to screw up. And I hate that. Like I have in the past had so many patterns of avoiding doing things that would be good for me and potentially good for other people out of fear of doing it wrong and fear of failing at it. Right. So it's like, let's avoid this situation because I don't want to do it wrong. I don't want to be called out. I'm going to say nothing because that way I can't say the wrong thing.
Right.
Right. And it's like that alone is part of the problem.
Yes.
And that's where it gets so messy and uncomfortable for me. It's like, I feel like I need to say something. I want to say something. I feel like it is my job and my responsibility to say something, but I also feel like I'm going to say the wrong thing and don't want to cause more problems or more harm. But saying nothing causes more harm. So I'm just,
Yeah, you actually just demonstrated how self-talk talks you out of actually using your voice.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's bringing that perspective as well of recognizing how our own insecurities and fears and beliefs about ourselves and how we're going to look impacts how we are going to use our voice in these kinds of important conversations.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I know for me, like taking a look at that whole conversation that just happened, and this was like real in my head, say maybe like 6 months ago, was a real conversation I was having in my head, and then removing myself from it and observing, like, this is what my own perspective looks like right now. This is what my inner talk, my conversation with myself looks like right now. So what am I going to do about it? I can either choose to say nothing and go with that sort of surface level belief of I'm doing the right thing to say nothing because then I can't say the wrong thing, which is also a cop out. Or I can say something and own the fact that if I say the wrong thing, I will learn from it and I will apologize from it and I will do better. right? As long as there's that commitment there to do better.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, and it's like to have that awareness
Mm-hmm.
is really an important part of this process.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such an important piece of the awareness, is being able to remove yourself from what's going on, and be the observer, looking at yourself, going, what am I telling myself? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I avoiding? And being able to gain that awareness. So I'm so
Yeah.
glad you brought that up.
Yeah. Depersonalizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, do you have any suggestions for creating spaces where people really do feel included and respected? What can we do there?
For people feeling included and respected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's funny because it really is about creating space for them. So, there's been a lot of, I've had questions from people around, if I see something happening, or behavior that's questionable, and it feels like it's excluding someone, like, do I step in? Do I say something? What do I do? And so to answer your question, it's actually asking the person who that behavior was directed towards what they need.
Mm-hmm.
What do you need? What can I do for you right now?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that creates space for people to be able to show up and say, this is how I want to be supported, this is how I want to be included, this is how I want, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I think, like, the biggest piece of that is like, I can't speak on behalf of everyone who feels excluded, right? So it's about asking the people in that particular scenario that you're in, or environment that you're in, what they need to feel included,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's a really important part of the conversation that we don't have, is like, we can make all these recommendations, but everybody has different needs. So what are the needs of the people in that space?
Yeah. And that's such a great reminder, because it's an easy thing to do. You can ask somebody, what do you need? How can I help you? You don't have to make up the answer in your
Mhm.
head. You don't have to know what somebody needs you to do. There's no mind reading that's required. You can just show up and ask, and then follow through with what they're asking for.
Yes. Yeah, and it's context dependent, right? Based on that person or group of people. So I know that sounds like a bit of a weird response, but it really is. Like, for a group of Black, Indigenous people of color in one organization, their needs are going to be different from another organization,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. So it really is asking that question. Asking the question, what do you need and how can I help you, is
Mhm.
creating space for inclusion, because it says, I'm willing to listen
Yeah.
and I'm willing to help. And sometimes the answer might be, actually, I don't want you to help.
Mhm.
And that's not a rejection. It's them saying what they need.
Yeah. So honor that.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's such a doable piece of, tangible takeaway information for people to say, be open, and look around at the people around you and just ask, what what can I do? What do you need? How can I help? We can
Yeah,
all do a little more of that.
absolutely.
Thank you so much. So, how can people learn more about you and your services and working with you, if they are recognizing this is an area for them to grow? How can you help them?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on my website. I'm at theconsciouscommunicator.ca. And you can connect with me on Instagram. My handle's at the Conscious Communicator. And I offer one-on-one coaching, and also group coaching, and training and consulting in any of these areas. So the best way is to just connect with me online. Shoot me a message and we would connect from there.
Brilliant. I love that. And I hope that for those of you listening, you will reach out to Fazeena and she can help you unpack what it is that you need to know that you don't yet know and how to do something different with it. Thank you so much, Fazeena, for joining me. It's been an amazing, brilliant conversation that definitely needs to continue ongoing into the foreseeable future. This is definitely not a one-time conversation where, everything comes to the surface and gets fixed at one time for anybody. But I'm really glad that you're here to open it up for people and that you have a way for people to continue facilitating these conversations and growing and learning with you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. It was a pleasure to be here and to have this conversation. It was a great one.
Absolutely. My pleasure. You've been listening to CareerBuzz, Canada's unique radio conversation that empowers lives, enriches careers, and energizes organizations. On CIUT 89.5 FM, I'm your host, Shelley DeLoyer, founder of Bright Futures Solutions, and you can find out more about me online at brightfutures.solutions. Thank you to my guest, Fazeena Haniff, the Conscious Communicator. For more information, her website is theconsciouscommunicator.ca. A MP3 recording of this show is available from CIUT.FM, and you can catch CareerBuzz every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on CIUT. I'm your host, Shelley DeLoyer. Thank you for listening to CareerBuzz.